The pounding of hooves echoed through the vast Wyoming prairie as the last rays of sunlight cast long shadows across the rolling landscape. Pearl Davies clutched her feverish son tighter against her chest, the child's labored breathing growing more concerning with each passing hour. Her modest homestead, situated 15 miles outside of Lusk, Wyoming territory, had never felt so isolated as it did in the summer of 1885. Pearl wiped a strand of auburn hair from her face, her green eyes constantly darting to the window, searching the horizon for any sign of movement. 4-year-old Samuel's normally rosy cheeks were now flushed crimson with fever, his small body radiating alarming heat through the thin cotton nightshirt. 3 days of this mysterious illness had left him weak, disoriented, and struggling to breathe. "Please hold on, my brave boy," Pearl whispered, pressing her lips to his burning forehead. A cloud of dust in the distance caught her attention. Pearl rose quickly from her rocking chair and moved to the window, hope flaring in her chest. She recognized the rider immediately, Jacob Forrester, a local rancher who occasionally checked on the homesteaders in the area. His reputation as one of the territory's most skilled horsemen was evident in the way he handled his magnificent chestnut stallion, urging the beast forward at a breakneck pace. Jacob dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his tall frame taking the porch steps 2 at a time. Pearl threw open the door, relief washing over her exhausted face. "Mr. Forrester, thank heaven you're here," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Jacob removed his hat, revealing tousled dark hair and concerned blue eyes. At 32, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd lived his life under the harsh western sun. "Mrs. Davies, I was passing by and thought to check on you and the boy." His expression grew serious as he took in her disheveled appearance and tear-stained cheeks. "What's happened?" Pearl stepped aside to let him enter the modest cabin. "It's Samuel. He's been burning with fever for 3 days now. Nothing I've tried has helped, not cold compresses, not willow bark tea. He's getting worse by the hour." Jacob approached the small bed where Samuel lay, his tiny chest rising and falling with obvious effort. The cowboy's calloused hand gently touched the child's forehead, and his brow furrowed with concern. "How long has he been breathing like this?" Jacob asked, his voice low and steady despite the worry evident in his eyes. "Since last night, it's getting harder for him." Pearl's voice broke. "I'm afraid I'm losing him, Mr. Forrester." Jacob straightened, his expression resolute. "He needs a doctor and proper medicine, immediately." Pearl wrung her hands in despair. "Dr. Miller won't be back in Lusk for another week. He's visiting the settlements north of here. There's another doctor in Douglas, but that's nearly 40 miles. Jacob's mind was already calculating distances and time. "Mrs. Davies, I believe your boy has pneumonia. My younger sister had similar symptoms when we were children." Pearl's eyes widened in fear. "Pneumonia? But that can—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "It can be deadly if not treated," Jacob said bluntly, "but there's still time." He placed his hat back on his head with determination. "I'll ride to Douglas for the doctor and medicine. But it's nearly nightfall and the journey is treacherous even in daylight," Pearl protested. Jacob was already moving toward the door. "I know these lands better than most. My horse is the fastest in the territory." He paused at the threshold, his eyes meeting hers. "Keep him cool, make him drink whatever he can keep down." Pearl followed him onto the porch, watching as he mounted his stallion in one fluid motion. "Mr. Forrester, I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks, Mrs. Davies." His expression softened momentarily. "Your husband was a good man. He'd expect no less from his neighbors." The mention of her late husband, gone 2 years now from a logging accident, brought fresh tears to Pearl's eyes. She'd been struggling to maintain the homestead alone since Thomas's death, determined to build the life they'd dreamed of for their son. Jacob tipped his hat, his eyes reflecting a promise. "I'll be back with help. You have my word." With that, he spurred his horse and galloped away, becoming a diminishing silhouette against the darkening prairie sky. Pearl stood watching long after he disappeared, one hand pressed to her heart, the other clutching the doorframe for support. "Please hurry," she whispered to the wind. Inside, Samuel moaned in his fitful sleep. Pearl returned to his bedside, dipping a cloth in cool water to place on his forehead. The night ahead would be the longest of her life, but for the first time in 3 days, a fragile hope had taken root in her heart. Jacob Forrester rode as if demons chased him, pushing his stallion, Thunder, harder than he ever had before. The darkness of the Wyoming night enveloped him, but the full moon provided enough light to navigate the familiar terrain. The summer night was mercifully clear, though a distant rumble of thunder warned of a potential storm brewing in the mountains. His mind raced with calculations and concerns. At Thunder's best pace, Douglas was still nearly 5 hours away. Then finding the doctor, convincing him to provide medicine or perhaps even return with him, it could be well into the next day before he made it back to the Davies homestead. Would the boy last that long? The image of Samuel's struggling breaths and Pearl's desperate eyes fueled his determination. Jacob had known Pearl Davies only in passing since she arrived in the territory with her husband and infant son 5 years ago. After Thomas Davies died, Jacob, like many in the community, had offered help when he could. Pearl, however, was fiercely independent, rarely accepting assistance beyond what propriety would allow a widow to receive from a single man. He admired her for that strength, even as it frustrated his attempts to ease her burden. There was something about Pearl Davies that had caught his attention from the first, perhaps the quiet dignity with which she faced adversity, or maybe the fierce love she showed her son. Either way, Jacob knew he would ride through hell itself if necessary to bring help to her door tonight. The terrain grew more challenging as he approached the foothills. Jacob leaned forward, whispering encouragement to Thunder. "Just a little faster, boy. Lives depend on us tonight." The stallion, seeming to understand the urgency, found reserves of energy and pushed forward. Jacob's thoughts drifted back to Pearl, alone in that cabin with her dying child. The unfairness of her situation struck him anew. She'd already lost so much, losing Samuel would surely break her. "Not tonight," Jacob muttered into the wind. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Hours into his journey, the promised storm finally caught up to him. Rain began falling in heavy sheets, turning the trail treacherous. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the path ahead before plunging everything back into deeper darkness. Thunder, living up to his namesake, remained steady despite the frightening conditions. Jacob's clothes were soaked through, his body chilled to the bone, but he pressed onward. When the trail narrowed alongside a steep ravine, he dismounted to lead Thunder through the most dangerous stretch, mud sucking at his boots with each careful step. It was nearly midnight when the lights of Douglas finally appeared in the distance. Relief flooded through him, but Jacob knew the hardest part of his mission still lay ahead. Finding the doctor and convincing him to help in the middle of the night would require both charm and forceful persuasion, perhaps even the substantial amount of money Jacob carried in his saddlebags. The main street of Douglas was deserted when Jacob arrived, save for the raucous sounds emanating from the saloon. He headed straight for the doctor's office, a small building adjacent to the town's only hotel. After tying Thunder to the hitching post, Jacob pounded on the door, heedless of the late hour. No response came. Jacob moved to the side of the building, noting a dim light in an upstairs window. He found a handful of small pebbles and tossed them at the glass, increasing the force until finally the window opened. A disheveled older man with a gray beard peered out. "Who in tarnation is causing this racket at this ungodly hour, Dr. Harrison?" Jacob called up. "I apologize for the disturbance, but I've ridden from Lusk. There's a child there with severe pneumonia who needs immediate medical attention." The doctor frowned. "Lusk, that's nearly 40 miles, and in this weather," he shook his head. "I can't possibly make that journey tonight." "Come back in the morning and we'll discuss." "The boy might not have until morning," Jacob interrupted, his voice rising with urgency. "I'm not asking you to come with me, though I'd welcome it. At minimum, I need medicine that might save him." Dr. Harrison seemed to study Jacob more carefully. "You rode all this way through that storm for someone else's child." "For a widow and her son," Jacob confirmed. "Please, doctor, I'm prepared to pay whatever you ask." Something in Jacob's desperate tone must have reached the physician. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Wait there. I'll be down directly." True to his word, within minutes the doctor appeared at the door, hastily dressed and carrying his medical bag. "Come in and tell me exactly what symptoms the child is displaying." Jacob followed him inside, relief washing over him. As the doctor lit additional lamps, Jacob described Samuel's condition in detail, including the progression of symptoms Pearl had shared. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly as he listened, moving to his cabinets to select various medicines. "Sounds like bacterial pneumonia, right enough. Dangerous in one so young." He began packaging several bottles. "This quinine will help with the fever. The eucalyptus oil needs to be added to boiling water for him to inhale the steam. It'll help clear his lungs. These powders are a mixture of compounds that will reduce inflammation." He continued explaining each medicine's purpose and proper administration as he worked. When finished, he handed Jacob a carefully wrapped parcel. "This is the best I can do without seeing the patient myself. If these don't improve his condition within a day, nothing short of my physical presence will help." The doctor hesitated, then added reluctantly, "If you truly believe the situation is that dire, I could attempt to follow you tomorrow." Jacob shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but the journey is treacherous even in daylight. These medicines will have to be enough." He reached into his pocket and placed several gold coins on the table, far more than the medicines were worth. The doctor's eyebrows rose at the generous payment, but he didn't refuse it. "You're taking an awful risk for folks who aren't your family." "Some things are worth the risk," Jacob replied simply, securing the precious medicines in his saddlebag. Outside, the rain had momentarily subsided, though lightning still illuminated the distant mountains. Jacob knew the respite was temporary. Thunder looked exhausted, but there was no time to rest. "One more great effort, old friend," Jacob murmured, patting the horse's neck before mounting. "Lives depend on us tonight," with a nod of gratitude to Dr. Harrison, who stood watching from his doorway. Jacob turned Thunder back toward Lusk and the long journey that lay ahead. Back at the Davies homestead, Pearl fought her own battle against exhaustion and fear. Samuel's condition had worsened, his breathing now accompanied by a frightening, rattling sound. Twice he had awakened disoriented, not recognizing her, before falling back into troubled sleep. Pearl had not left his side except to stoke the fire or fetch fresh water. Her prayers had become a constant whisper, a desperate plea to a God she sometimes feared had forgotten her. The rainstorm that swept through added to her anxiety. Was Jacob Forrester caught in that deluge? Had her desperate hope been washed away in mud and flash floods? As the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin windows, Pearl's resolve began to crumble. Samuel had grown alarmingly still, his breathing shallow. She held his tiny hand in hers, pressing it to her lips. "Stay with me, my love," she pleaded. "Mr. Forrester is coming with medicine. Just hold on a little longer." Outside, the world was awakening. Birds began their morning songs, unaware of the drama unfolding within the cabin walls. Pearl moved to the window, scanning the horizon once more, hope and despair warring within her heart. The emptiness of the landscape nearly broke her. No riders, no dust clouds, no sign of the help she so desperately needed. Pearl closed her eyes, allowing tears to fall freely for the first time since Samuel had fallen ill. "I can't lose you too," she whispered, returning to her son's bedside. She was bathing his face with cool water when she heard the distant but unmistakable sound of hoofbeats approaching at speed. Pearl bolted to the door, throwing it open just as Jacob Forrester came into view. The sight of him nearly stopped her heart. He was barely recognizable, covered in mud, his clothes torn, blood visible on his face and hands. Yet he rode with singular purpose, his stallion equally mud-splattered and clearly exhausted. Pearl ran into the yard, heedless of the morning dew soaking her skirts. Jacob dismounted heavily, staggering slightly before steadying himself. In his hands he clutched a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "Mrs. Davies," he managed, his voice hoarse from hours in the elements. "The doctor in Douglas provided medicines. How is Samuel?" "Alive, but fading," Pearl answered, reaching for the package with trembling hands. "Mr. Forrester, you're injured, nothing that won't heal," he dismissed her concern. "Let's tend to your boy first." Together they entered the cabin. Jacob's face grew grave when he saw Samuel, understanding immediately how precarious the child's condition had become. He unwrapped the medicines and began explaining their purposes as Pearl prepared them according to his instructions. "The doctor said the eucalyptus needs to be added to boiling water," Jacob explained, opening one of the bottles. The sharp, medicinal scent filled the small cabin. "The steam will help his breathing. The quinine powder goes into water for his fever." Pearl worked quickly, following every instruction with desperate precision. When the eucalyptus steam filled the room, she gently lifted Samuel to help him breathe it in. His eyes fluttered open briefly at the movement. "That's it, brave boy," Jacob encouraged from beside them. "Breathe deep now." Pearl managed to get Samuel to swallow a few sips of the quinine mixture before he drifted off again. His breathing, while still labored, seemed marginally easier after exposure to the steam. Only when the medicines had been administered did Pearl turn her attention fully to Jacob. He had sunk into a chair, exhaustion finally claiming its due now that his mission was completed. "You're bleeding," Pearl said, noticing a cut above his eye and several on his hands. "What happened?" Jacob tried to smile but winced instead. "Thunder and I had a disagreement with a ravine on the return journey. The storm washed out part of the trail." He glanced toward the window. "He's a good horse. Deserves better than the ride I put him through." "I'll tend to him after I see to your injuries," Pearl promised, already gathering clean cloths and water. "Mrs. Davies, that's not necessary. It is absolutely necessary," she interrupted firmly. "You may have saved my son's life tonight, Mr. Forrester. The least I can do is clean your wounds." Jacob fell silent, too exhausted to argue further. Pearl worked gently, cleaning mud and blood from his face and hands. As she tended to him, she noticed other bruises forming on his arms, a torn shoulder on his shirt revealing what looked like rope burns beneath. "You could have died out there," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Jacob's eyes met hers. "Some risks are worth taking, Mrs. Davies, Pearl," she corrected softly. "After what you've done, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." A small smile touched his lips. "Pearl," he repeated. "It suits you." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of the bond forged through this ordeal. Pearl looked away first, suddenly conscious of their proximity and the intimacy of tending his injuries. "You need rest," she said, moving back. "I can make up a pallet for you, or I'll rest right here for a bit," Jacob said, indicating the chair. "I want to be nearby in case Samuel needs another dose of medicine." Pearl nodded, understanding his concern. "I'll see to your horse then." Outside, she found Thunder standing patiently at the hitching post, head hanging with exhaustion. Pearl led him to the small stable behind the cabin, removing his saddle and bridle with careful hands. The magnificent animal was indeed as mud-covered as his rider, with several scratches on his legs that spoke of a treacherous journey. "You're a hero too," Pearl murmured, brushing him down and checking his hooves for stones. She provided fresh water and the best feed she had, then patted his neck gratefully before returning to the cabin. Inside, she found Jacob exactly where she'd left him, though his eyes were now closed, his breathing deep and even. Pearl covered him with a blanket, careful not to wake him. Then she returned to Samuel's bedside, checking his temperature with the back of her hand. It seemed, perhaps, slightly lower than before. His breathing, while still concerning, had lost some of the frightening rattle. Was it her imagination, or was there already improvement from the medicines? Pearl settled into the chair opposite Jacob, prepared to maintain her vigil. As the morning light strengthened, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, she found herself studying the man who had risked everything for her child. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, revealing a vulnerability rarely displayed in his waking hours. What kind of man rides through a storm-ravaged night for a woman and child who are little more than acquaintances? The question lingered in her mind as exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy sleep. The next several hours passed in a cycle of medication, monitoring, and brief, restless sleep for both adults. By midday, it became undeniable Samuel was improving. His fever had dropped considerably, and his breathing, while still congested, no longer carried the frightening struggle of the previous night. When the boy awoke and recognized Pearl, asking weakly for water, she nearly collapsed with relief. Jacob, who had been preparing another steam treatment, smiled broadly at the sound of the child's voice. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Samuel repeated, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Of course, my love," Pearl answered, her voice breaking with emotion as she helped him sip water. "How are you feeling? My chest hurts," the boy admitted, then noticed Jacob standing nearby. "Mr. Forrester, why are you here? Did you bring thunder?" Jacob approached the bed, kneeling beside it to be at eye level with the child. "I did bring thunder. He's resting in your stable now." "We had quite an adventure last night." Samuel's eyes widened with interest. "What kind of adventure?" "The kind best saved for when you're stronger," Jacob replied with a gentle smile. "For now, you need to keep resting and take the medicine your mother gives you." Samuel nodded solemnly, then surprised both adults by reaching for Jacob's hand. "Thank you for helping us, Mr. Forrester. Mama says you're the best horseman in all of Wyoming territory." Pearl blushed at having her private assessments revealed, but Jacob merely squeezed the boy's hand. "Your mama gives me too much credit, but I'm glad I could help." As Samuel drifted back to sleep, Jacob straightened and met Pearl's gaze. "The worst has passed, I think. The doctor said to continue with the medicines for at least 3 days, but the improvement we're seeing is a very good sign." Pearl nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Without thinking, she stepped forward and embraced Jacob, her arms wrapping tightly around him. After a moment of surprise, his arms encircled her in return. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "I can never repay what you've done." Jacob's hand moved gently over her hair. "There's nothing to repay, Pearl." When she stepped back, embarrassed by her impulsive display of emotion, Jacob cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "I should check on Thunder and make some repairs to your stable door." It was looking a bit worse for wear. "You've done more than enough," Pearl protested. "You should be resting." "I've rested," he insisted. "And I find keeping busy helps clear the mind." Before she could argue further, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Pearl sank into the chair beside Samuel's bed, her fingers touching her lips thoughtfully. Something had shifted between them, something she wasn't entirely prepared to examine. For now, it was enough that her son was on the mend, thanks to a cowboy who'd ridden through hell to save him. Outside, Jacob leaned against the stable wall, taking deep breaths of the summer air. He hadn't been entirely truthful with Pearl. His body ached from the punishing ride, and the cut above his eye throbbed painfully. But remaining in that cabin, with Pearl's gratitude shining in her eyes and the memory of her embrace still warming his skin, had suddenly seemed dangerous in an entirely different way. Jacob Forrester was not a man given to flights of fancy or romantic notions. At 32, he'd built a respectable ranch through hard work and careful planning, not impulsive decisions. Yet something about Pearl Davies had gotten under his skin from the first moment he'd seen her arrive in Lusk 5 years ago, her infant son in her arms and determination in her stance, despite the obvious challenges facing a young family in the Wyoming territory. Even after Thomas Davies' death, Jacob had kept a respectful distance, knowing a widow with a young child had enough to manage without unwanted attention. He'd limited his interactions to occasional checks on their welfare and practical assistance when circumstances allowed. Last night had changed something. Riding through that storm, facing death more than once when the trail gave way beneath Thunder's hooves, Jacob had been forced to confront why he was willing to risk everything for this particular widow and her child. The answer that had come to him in the darkness was both simple and terrifying. He cared for them. More than was proper. More than he'd allowed himself to acknowledge. Jacob shook his head to clear these dangerous thoughts and set about examining the stable door. As he suspected, several hinges were loose and one board was cracked. Simple repairs that would give his hand something to do besides reaching for what he shouldn't want. He was halfway through replacing the broken board when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Pearl approached with a tin cup of coffee and a plate of food. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, offering the simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices. "It's not much, I'm afraid." Jacob accepted the food gratefully. It's perfect, thank you, how's Samuel? Still sleeping peacefully. She watched him take a long drink of coffee. His fever is nearly gone. I can hardly believe the improvement in just a few hours. Children are remarkably resilient, Jacob commented, though I suspect your boy gets his strength from his mother. A blush colored Pearl's cheeks. Perhaps a bit from both parents. Thomas was the strongest man I knew until she stopped, pain flashing across her features. Jacob set down his cup. Your husband was well respected in these parts. His death was deeply felt by many. Pearl nodded, composing herself. 2 years, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like another lifetime entirely. She gestured to the homestead around them. He had such dreams for this place. You've done remarkably well maintaining it alone, Jacob observed sincerely. Some days are better than others, Pearl admitted. This land can be unforgiving to those who don't respect its power. Or to those who ride foolishly through storms, Jacob added with a self-deprecating smile. Pearl's expression grew serious. There was nothing foolish about what you did, Mr. Forrester. At his raised eyebrow, she corrected herself. Jacob, it was the bravest thing I've ever witnessed. He shifted uncomfortably under her admiring gaze. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly, not anyone. Not through that storm, not at such risk. She hesitated, then added softly, why did you, Jacob? Truly, the directness of her question caught him off guard. Jacob looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. Because I couldn't bear the thought of you losing your son, he answered honestly. Because you've faced enough sorrow. Is that the only reason? Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob met her eyes then, reading the vulnerability there. He could lie, maintain the proper distance that society expected between a widow and a bachelor. Or he could speak the truth that had driven him through that storm. No, he admitted finally. That's not the only reason. The simple confession hung in the air between them, neither willing to be the first to acknowledge its implications. After a long moment, Pearl nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. Samuel has been asking for you, she said, her tone lighter though her eyes remained intense. When you're finished with your repairs, perhaps you could tell him a story. He's quite fascinated by Thunder's adventures. I'd be honored, Jacob replied, understanding that she was offering neither rejection nor encouragement, merely time. Pearl turned to go, then paused. I plan to make a proper dinner tonight. It would please us both if you would join us. I wouldn't miss it, Jacob assured her, watching as she walked back to the cabin. He returned to his repairs with renewed energy, aware that something significant had shifted between them. It wasn't a declaration or a promise, merely an acknowledgement of possibilities. For a man accustomed to the harsh certainties of the Wyoming territory, such possibilities felt like the most precious gift imaginable. The next 2 days established a gentle rhythm as Samuel continued to recover, and Jacob made himself useful around the homestead. There were countless small repairs that Pearl had been unable to manage alone: a leaky roof section, loose porch boards, a stubborn water pump. Jacob tackled each task methodically, finding satisfaction in improving the safety and comfort of their living conditions. Pearl, for her part, seemed to bloom under the shared burden of responsibility. With Jacob handling the more physically demanding tasks, she was able to focus her attention on Samuel's recovery and the domestic aspects of running the homestead. Her cooking, always practical and nourishing, became more elaborate as she incorporated herbs from her small garden and techniques she rarely had time to employ. Their conversations, initially centered around Samuel's health and homestead matters, gradually expanded to include personal histories and future hopes. Jacob learned that Pearl had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a bookkeeper, and had met Thomas Davies when he came east seeking investors for Western ventures. Their whirlwind courtship had scandalized her conservative family, who considered the frontier a place of savagery and hardship. They weren't entirely wrong about the hardship, Pearl admitted one evening as they sat on the porch after Samuel had gone to sleep. But they couldn't understand the freedom that comes with it, the chance to build something that's truly your own. Jacob nodded in understanding. My father felt the same when he brought our family west from Boston. My mother never quite adjusted. She passed when I was 14, but my father found his purpose here. And you, did you find your purpose as well? Pearl asked. Jacob considered the question thoughtfully. I found satisfaction in ranching. Purpose? He shook his head slightly. I'm not sure I'd call it that exactly. What would you call it then? A good life, he replied simply. Honest work, a decent living, but sometimes I wonder if there shouldn't be more to it than that. Pearl's eyes reflected the fading light. I've wondered the same thing. After Thomas died, just surviving day to day with Samuel took everything I had. Lately, though, she trailed off. Lately, Jacob prompted gently. Lately, I've started to think about more than just survival, she finished. About what kind of life I want for Samuel, what kind of mother I want to be, whether this homestead is truly where we belong. Alarm flickered through Jacob. You're considering leaving Lusk, Pearl seemed to register his concern. Not immediately. But eventually, I may need to consider Samuel's education, opportunities that might not be available here. The territory is growing rapidly, Jacob pointed out. Schools are being established in most communities. Lusk will have a proper schoolhouse soon enough. Perhaps, Pearl acknowledged. Though there are other considerations as well. Jacob wanted to ask what those considerations might be, whether they included companionship, marriage, a father for Samuel, but hesitated to presume. Instead, he changed the subject to safer territory, discussing the weather forecast and the likelihood of an early autumn. On the third day, when it became clear that Samuel was well on the road to full recovery, Jacob knew he could no longer justify his continued presence at the Davies homestead. His own ranch, managed by his capable foreman in his absence, nevertheless required his attention. More importantly, remaining longer might raise eyebrows in the community, potentially damaging Pearl's reputation. He announced his intention to depart the following morning while helping Pearl hang laundry on the line behind the cabin. Samuel was nearby, his energy returning as he chased grasshoppers through the tall grass. Of course, Pearl replied, her expression carefully neutral as she pinned a sheet to the line. You've already done far more than anyone could expect. Your own affairs must need attention. They do, Jacob admitted, though I'd be pleased to check on you both when I'm in the area. Pearl nodded, keeping her eyes on her task. We would welcome the company. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken thoughts. Jacob was searching for the right words when Samuel came running up, clutching something in his small hands. Mr. Forrester, look what I caught. The boy opened his cupped palms to reveal a small horned toad, its spiny body perfectly still in the child's gentle grip. Isn't he magnificent? Jacob knelt down to admire the creature. He certainly is, quite the fearsome hunter of insects, these fellows. Samuel beamed at having his find appreciated. Can I keep him? I'll build him a special home, Pearl intervened gently. Creatures like this belong in the wild, Samuel. They're not meant to be pets. The boy's face fell, but he nodded in understanding. Then I'll just visit him. I'll name him Thunderbolt after Mr. Forrester's horse. He looked up at Jacob. Will you come see him with me sometimes? Jacob glanced at Pearl, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of permission. I'd like that very much, Samuel. In fact, I was just telling your mother that I'll be visiting regularly to check on you both. Samuel's expression brightened immediately. Good, because I need to learn how to ride like you. Mama says I'm still too small for my own horse, but I'm growing every day. That you are, Jacob agreed, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. And when the time is right, I'd be honored to help you learn. Promise? Samuel insisted, his small face serious. I promise, Jacob replied, equally serious. Satisfied, Samuel carefully set the horned toad back in the grass and watched it scurry away. I'm going to find Thunderbolt a beetle to eat, he announced, dashing off again with the boundless energy of a recovering child. When Jacob straightened and turned back to Pearl, he found her watching him with an unreadable expression. You're very good with him, she observed quietly. He makes it easy, Jacob replied. He's a remarkable boy, Pearl's fingers twisted in the fabric of her apron. Samuel has grown quite attached to you in these few days. The feeling is mutual, Jacob assured her. I hope you know that my offer to visit was sincere. I do know that, Pearl said, and I appreciate it more than I can express. Samuel hasn't had many male influences in his life since Thomas passed. Jacob hesitated, then decided to speak plainly. Pearl, I hope you understand that my interest in visiting extends beyond just concern for Samuel's welfare. Her eyes met his directly. I believe I do understand that, Jacob. And how do you feel about it? He asked, his heart beating faster despite his outwardly calm demeanor. Pearl considered her words carefully. I feel that it's complicated. I'm a widow with responsibilities. You're a bachelor with a successful ranch. The community has expectations about proper behavior. I'm well aware of those expectations, Jacob acknowledged, and I have nothing but respect for your position, but I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that these past few days have confirmed feelings I've harbored for some time. A blush rose on Pearl's cheeks. Jacob, you don't need to respond now, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to call on you properly, with the community's knowledge and approval, to get to know you and Samuel better and to let you know me. Pearl's expression softened. That seems like a reasonable request. Then you'll allow it, Jacob asked, hope rising in his chest. I will, she agreed with a small smile, though I make no promises beyond that. I wouldn't ask for promises, Jacob assured her, only possibilities. The word hung between them, ripe with potential. Pearl nodded once, then turned back to her laundry, though Jacob noticed her hands trembled slightly as she reached for another sheet. That evening, their last dinner together was a quietly celebratory affair. Samuel, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents between the adults, dominated the conversation with plans for visiting Thunderbolt, the horned toad, and questions about Thunder the horse. Jacob answered each inquiry patiently, his eyes occasionally meeting Pearl's across the table, sharing silent amusement at the boy's curiosity. After Samuel was tucked into bed, Jacob and Pearl sat on the porch, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. The summer night was warm, filled with the sounds of cicadas and distant coyote calls. Will you return to Lusk first or directly to your ranch? Pearl asked, breaking the comfortable silence. To the ranch initially, Jacob replied. I need to check on operations and my staff. But I have business in Lusk next week that will bring me to town. Perhaps you could join us for Sunday dinner after church services, Pearl suggested. If you'd like, Jacob smiled. I would like that very much. They lapsed back into silence, neither feeling the need to fill it with unnecessary words. Tomorrow would bring separation, but also the beginning of something neither had anticipated just a few days ago. When Jacob finally rose to retire to the small pallet he'd been using in the main room, Pearl stood as well. In the silver moonlight, she looked almost ethereal, her auburn hair gleaming with hidden highlights. Thank you again, Jacob, for everything, she said softly. It was my honor, he replied simply. Impulsively, Pearl stepped forward and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. Before he could react, she had slipped inside the cabin, leaving Jacob standing on the porch, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had briefly rested. Morning brought the inevitable parting. Jacob saddled Thunder, who looked refreshed after several days of rest and good feeding. Samuel clung to his hand, extracting multiple promises about future visits and horseback riding lessons. Pearl stood slightly apart, her face composed though her eyes revealed more complex emotions. When Samuel finally released Jacob to chase after a butterfly, she approached. Safe travels, Jacob, she said, handing him a small package. Some provisions for your journey. Thank you. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through Jacob's arm. I'll see you next Sunday after services. Pearl nodded, a small smile touching her lips. We'll look forward to it. As Jacob mounted Thunder and turned toward home, he carried with him more than just the memory of a harrowing night ride and a child saved from illness. He carried the possibility of a future he had never dared to imagine, a future that included not just his ranch and his achievements, but a family. Pearl and Samuel Davies had somehow become central to his vision of that future in just a few short days, spurring Thunder into a canter. Jacob looked back once to see Pearl and Samuel waving from the porch of their cabin. He raised his hat in farewell, his heart lighter than it had been in years despite the physical distance growing between them. Some journeys, Jacob reflected as he rode toward home, changed a man forever. The journey to Douglas had been one such expedition, not because of the physical challenges overcome, but because of what awaited him at journey's end. A widow with copper hair and determined eyes, a boy with endless questions and a brave heart. And possibilities as vast as the Wyoming sky stretching above him. True to his word, Jacob Forrester appeared at the Davies homestead the following Sunday after church services in Lusk. Pearl and Samuel had ridden into town in their small wagon for the weekly gathering, where Samuel proudly told anyone who would listen about his recent illness and Mr. Forrester's heroic midnight ride for medicine. The story had already spread through the small community. Of course, news traveled quickly in frontier settlements, especially news involving life-threatening illness and dramatic rescues. Pearl had endured knowing looks from the local women and a few direct questions about Jacob's extended stay at her homestead during Samuel's recovery. Mrs. Nelson asked if you were courting me, Pearl informed Jacob as they sat on her porch after dinner, watching Samuel demonstrate his improved health by attempting cartwheels in the yard. Jacob's eyebrows rose. And what did you tell her? That you had been kind enough to assist during Samuel's illness and make some necessary repairs to my property, Pearl replied primly. A perfectly proper response, Jacob nodded, amusement playing at the corners of his mouth, though not precisely an answer to her question. Pearl gave him a sideways glance. I thought it best not to encourage speculation, especially when I myself am uncertain of the answer. Jacob turned to face her more directly. Would it help if I clarified my intentions? A mixture of anticipation and apprehension flashed across Pearl's features. Perhaps it would. Jacob took a deep breath. Pearl Davies, I would very much like to court you properly, with the community's knowledge and your explicit permission. I have come to care deeply for both you and Samuel, and while I understand that your heart may not be ready for such considerations, I would be honored if you would allow me the opportunity to earn your affection. The formal declaration hung in the air between them. Pearl's hands twisted in her lap as she considered his words. Finally, she raised her eyes to meet his. Jacob, I would be dishonest if I said I felt nothing for you, she began carefully. Your bravery in saving Samuel has certainly earned my deepest gratitude. But gratitude is not the same as the feelings that should exist between a man and woman contemplating a future together. Jacob nodded, accepting her caution. I understand the distinction. However, Pearl continued, I find myself interested in discovering whether what I feel might grow into something more substantial. A blush colored her cheeks. So yes, I would permit your courtship, with the understanding that I make no promises regarding the outcome. Relief and joy spread through Jacob's chest. I couldn't ask for more than that opportunity, Pearl, she smiled then, the expression transforming her face. Samuel will be overjoyed. He's already asked 3 times today when you would be visiting again. As if hearing his name, Samuel came running up to the porch. Mr. Forrester, did you see my cartwheel? I'm getting much better, aren't I? Remarkably better, Jacob agreed seriously. A few more days of practice and you'll be ready to join the circus. Samuel's eyes widened at the prospect before he caught the teasing gleam in Jacob's expression. You're funning me, he accused, though he was grinning. Perhaps a little, Jacob admitted, but your improvement is genuine. Soon enough you'll be strong enough for your first riding lesson. The boy's expression grew serious. You promised to teach me, do you still mean it? I always keep my promises, Samuel, Jacob assured him. In fact, I've been thinking about a gentle mare on my ranch that might be perfect for a beginning rider. Samuel nearly vibrated with excitement. A real horse for me? When can I meet her? Does she have a name? How old is she? Pearl intervened before the questions could continue indefinitely. Samuel, why don't you fetch the checkerboard? Mr. Forrester mentioned earlier that he enjoys the game. The boy dashed inside, leaving the adults smiling at his enthusiasm. You've made his day with talk of a horse, Pearl observed. Though I hope you know what you're starting, he'll talk of nothing else for weeks. I don't mind, Jacob assured her, and I meant what I said. I have a perfect mount for beginners. 6 years old, gentle disposition, responsive to the lightest touch. I use her to train new ranch hands who have never ridden before. Pearl's expression grew thoughtful. It's been so long since I've ridden myself. Thomas and I used to ride together before Samuel was born. Perhaps you'd like to join your son for lessons, Jacob suggested. I could bring 2 horses next time I visit. The idea clearly appealed to Pearl, though she hesitated. It seems like an imposition. You're already doing so much. It would be my pleasure, Jacob insisted. Truly. Their conversation was interrupted by Samuel's return with the checkerboard. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly with games, conversation, and the sharing of a freshly baked apple pie that Pearl had prepared for the occasion. When the time came for Jacob to depart, Samuel extracted another promise regarding horses and riding lessons. Pearl walked Jacob to where Thunder was tethered, standing slightly apart as the rancher checked his saddle and prepared to mount. "Thank you for dinner," Jacob said. "And for your answer regarding my question." Pearl nodded, suddenly shy in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. "When will you visit again?" "I have business in Cheyenne that will take me away for about 10 days, Jacob replied. "After that, I'm at your disposal." "We'll look forward to it," Pearl said, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping away. Jacob mounted Thunder, tipping his hat in farewell. "Take care, Pearl Davies, and you, Jacob Forrester," she returned softly. As he rode away, Jacob could feel her watching him go. The sensation warmed him more effectively than the summer sun on his shoulders. The following weeks established a pattern that the small community of Lusk quickly recognized as courtship. Jacob visited the Davies homestead regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book for Samuel, fabric for Pearl, occasionally fresh meat or fish that were scarce commodities for homesteaders. He attended church services when in town, sitting with Pearl and Samuel with increasing regularity. For Pearl, the courtship brought unexpected pleasures and challenges. Having focused solely on survival since Thomas's death, she'd forgotten the simple joy of adult conversation, of shared laughter, of having someone notice when she changed her hairstyle or wore a particular dress. Jacob was attentive without being presumptuous, respectful of her independence while offering genuine assistance when needed. Most important to Pearl was his relationship with Samuel. Jacob treated the boy not as an obstacle to overcome in his pursuit of her, but as a person in his own right, someone whose opinions mattered, whose questions deserved thoughtful answers, whose dreams were worth nurturing. The promised riding lessons became reality in late August, when Jacob arrived one Saturday morning leading not only Thunder but 2 additional horses, a dappled gray mare named Whisper, and a smaller chestnut gelding called Cinnamon. Samuel could barely contain his excitement as Jacob explained the basics of horsemanship, starting with proper grooming and care before even considering mounting. Pearl watched from the porch as her son absorbed every word Jacob spoke, his small face serious with concentration as he learned to brush Cinnamon's coat and pick debris from his hooves. There was something deeply moving about the scene, this strong, capable man patiently instructing her child, passing on knowledge with gentle guidance rather than stern commands. When Jacob finally helped Samuel onto Cinnamon's back for the first time, leading the horse in a slow circle around the yard, Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes. It was a moment Thomas should have witnessed, a father teaching his son an essential skill of Western life. Yet as she blinked away the moisture, Pearl realized she wasn't feeling grief so much as gratitude. Samuel was experiencing this milestone after all, thanks to Jacob's generosity. "Your turn," Jacob called to Pearl after Samuel had completed several successful circuits of the yard. Pearl hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. "It's been years, I'm not sure I remember how." "Some things the body doesn't forget," Jacob assured her, helping Samuel dismount. "Besides, Whisper here is the gentlest mount in the territory. She practically reads your thoughts." Samuel added his encouragement. "Please, Mama, it's wonderful, you feel so tall up there." Unable to resist their combined persuasion, Pearl approached the gray mare, who regarded her with intelligent, calm eyes. Jacob offered a hand and Pearl found herself lifted effortlessly onto Whisper's back. "There now," Jacob said, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate her. "Just sit tall and relaxed, let your body move with hers." As Jacob led Whisper around the yard, Pearl did indeed find that her body remembered the rhythm of horseback riding. By the third circuit, she was smiling, enjoying the gentle motion and elevated perspective. "I think you're ready to take the reins," Jacob suggested, offering them to her. Pearl accepted, her confidence growing as Whisper responded to her lightest touch. Soon she was guiding the mare independently, making wider circles around the yard while Samuel cheered her on. "Look at you, Mrs. Davies," Jacob said warmly when she finally brought Whisper to a halt beside him. "A natural horsewoman," Pearl laughed, flushed with pleasure and the mild exertion. "Hardly natural, but certainly enjoying myself more than I expected." Jacob reached up to help her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. When Pearl's feet touched the ground, she found herself standing very close to him, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that sent a corresponding heat through her veins. "Thank you," she said softly. "My pleasure," he replied, his voice equally low. The moment was broken by Samuel tugging at Jacob's sleeve. "Can I go again, please?" The riding lessons became a regular feature of Jacob's visits. By mid-September, both Pearl and Samuel were confident enough to venture beyond the homestead's immediate surroundings, exploring the beautiful countryside under Jacob's watchful guidance. During one such excursion, they stopped for a picnic lunch beside a small creek that cut through the rolling prairie. Samuel, having finished his sandwich, asked permission to search for interesting rocks along the water's edge. "Stay where we can see you," Pearl cautioned as he dashed off. Jacob spread his coat on the ground for Pearl to sit upon, then settled beside her. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, the creek's gentle burbling a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "He's becoming quite the horseman," Jacob observed, watching as Samuel carefully navigated the creek's rocky edge. "Natural seat, good instincts about how to communicate with his mount," Pearl nodded proudly. "He talks about nothing else when you're not here. Mr. Forrester says this, and Mr. Forrester taught me that. I believe you've thoroughly replaced the circus as his life's ambition. He now wants to be a rancher like you." Jacob smiled at this, though something in his expression seemed wistful. It's good for a boy to have dreams, to see possibilities for his future. "You've given him that gift," Pearl said softly, "among many others." Jacob turned to look at her directly. "And what about you, Pearl? What dreams do you harbor?" The question caught her off guard. "Dreams? I'm not sure I allow myself that luxury very often." "Perhaps you should," Jacob suggested. "The future isn't just Samuel's to imagine." Pearl plucked a blade of grass, twirling it between her fingers as she considered. "When Thomas died, my only dream was survival, keeping this homestead, raising Samuel, honoring the life we'd planned together." She paused, watching the grass spin. "Lately, though, I've found myself thinking beyond mere survival." "What thoughts have you been entertaining?" Jacob asked, his voice carefully neutral. Pearl met his gaze directly. "Thoughts of companionship, of partnership. Of perhaps not facing every challenge alone." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Jacob reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. "Pearl, Mama, Mr. Forrester, look what I found." Samuel's excited voice interrupted whatever Jacob had been about to say. The boy came running toward them, clutching something in his small fist. Pearl extracted her hand from Jacob's as Samuel arrived, breathlessly displaying his discovery, a perfectly heart-shaped stone, smooth and gray with a vein of white quartz running through its center. "It's beautiful," Pearl exclaimed, examining the stone. "What a special find." "It reminded me of Thunder's marking," Samuel explained, pointing to the white streak. "But then I thought it looks like a heart, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Jacob agreed. "An exceptional specimen." Samuel beamed with pride, then surprised them both by offering the stone to Jacob. "It's for you, a present, for teaching me to ride and for saving me when I was sick." Jacob accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity. "I'll treasure it, Samuel, thank you." The boy nodded, satisfied, then announced his intention to search for more remarkable stones. As he dashed back to the creek, Jacob carefully tucked the heart-shaped rock into his shirt pocket. "He has his mother's generous spirit," Jacob commented. Pearl watched her son, a mixture of pride and something like melancholy washing over her. "He's growing up so quickly. Sometimes I look at him and can hardly believe he's the same infant who arrived here 5 years ago." "That's the nature of children, I'm told," Jacob said. Always changing, always surprising. Have you never wanted children of your own? Pearl asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its implications. If Jacob was startled by the directness of her inquiry, he didn't show it. I've always assumed I would have a family someday. The right circumstances simply hadn't presented themselves. His eyes met hers meaningfully, until perhaps now Pearl felt heat rise in her cheeks at his implication. Jacob, are you suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing specific at this moment, he interrupted gently. Merely acknowledging that my thoughts about family have become considerably more concrete in recent months. Before Pearl could formulate a response, Samuel called out again, this time with alarm in his voice. Mama, there's a snake. Both adults were on their feet instantly, moving quickly toward the boy who had backed away from the creek's edge. Jacob reached him first, placing a protective hand on Samuel's shoulder as he surveyed the situation. A medium-sized rattlesnake was coiled on a rock near where Samuel had been exploring, its distinctive rattling tail raised in warning. The boy had retreated a safe distance, but was clearly shaken by the encounter. You did exactly right, Samuel, Jacob praised, keeping his voice calm. You saw the danger and moved away without panicking. Pearl arrived, automatically checking her son for any signs of injury, though she knew Jacob would have already done so. Are you all right, darling? Samuel nodded, still wide-eyed but composed. It surprised me. I was looking for more heart stones and then I heard the rattle. That rattle is the snake's way of warning you, Jacob explained. It doesn't want to bite unless it has to defend itself. You respected its warning and that was very wise. The boy seemed reassured by this explanation, his natural curiosity overcoming his initial fear. What kind of snake is it? A prairie rattlesnake, Jacob replied. Common in these parts, best to give them space when encountered. Pearl, less enthusiastic about the educational opportunity, suggested they pack up their picnic and head back to the homestead. As they collected their belongings, she noticed Samuel watching Jacob with renewed admiration. You weren't scared of the snake at all, the boy observed. Jacob smiled. I respect snakes, but I understand them. Most creatures aren't looking for trouble, they just want to be left in peace. Like people? Samuel asked thoughtfully. Very much like people, Jacob agreed, helping the boy mount Cinnamon. As they rode home, Pearl reflected on the day's events, the peaceful picnic, the moment of connection with Jacob interrupted by Samuel's discovery, the snake encounter that had revealed yet another aspect of Jacob's character. Each experience seemed to be drawing them closer together, weaving their lives into an increasingly complex tapestry. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, Pearl and Jacob sat on the porch as had become their custom. The night was cooler than usual, hinting at the approaching change of seasons. Jacob had built a small fire in the yard, its flames casting dancing shadows across their faces. Thank you for today, Pearl said, breaking a comfortable silence. Despite the snake, it was a lovely outing. Jacob nodded, his eyes on the fire. Samuel handled himself well. You've raised a level-headed boy. I've tried, Pearl acknowledged, though lately I've had considerable help in that endeavor. Jacob turned to look at her, the firelight highlighting the strong planes of his face. Pearl, there's something I need to say to you. The seriousness of his tone made her heart beat faster. Yes. These past months, spending time with you and Samuel have been the happiest of my life, Jacob began, his voice low but clear. I came to your homestead that night in July as a neighbor offering assistance, but I find myself here now as a man who has discovered what was missing in his life. Pearl felt her breath catch in her throat. I love you, Pearl Davies, Jacob continued simply. I love your strength, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you've raised Samuel to be thoughtful and brave. I love the future I can imagine building with you both. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the heart-shaped stone Samuel had given him earlier. I believe some things are meant to be, though I've never been a particularly fanciful man. Finding this today seemed like a sign that I shouldn't wait any longer to speak my heart. Pearl's eyes filled with tears, though she couldn't have said whether they were tears of joy or fear or some complex mixture of emotions. Jacob, he held up a hand gently. You don't need to respond tonight. I know this is sudden, though my feelings have been growing since long before Samuel's illness. I just wanted you to know where I stand, and that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored to call you my wife and Samuel my son." The declaration hung in the air between them, as tangible as the heart-shaped stone in Jacob's palm. Pearl found herself at a rare loss for words, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his eyes and voice. Finally, she reached out and closed his fingers around the stone. "Keep this safe," she whispered. "I need a little time," Jacob nodded, understanding in his expression. "Take all the time you need, Pearl. I'm not going anywhere." The following weeks brought change to the Wyoming territory. The first snow fell in early October, earlier than usual, dusting the prairie with white and reminding residents that the harsh winter months were approaching. Homesteaders and ranchers alike hurried to complete final preparations, storing food, repairing structures, ensuring livestock had adequate shelter. For Pearl, the change in seasons was accompanied by internal turbulence. Jacob's declaration had forced her to confront feelings she'd been carefully managing. The widow of Thomas Davies found herself standing at a crossroads, knowing that whatever path she chose would irrevocably alter her and Samuel's future. Jacob, true to his word, continued his visits without pressing for an answer. If anything, he seemed more relaxed now that his feelings were in the open, content to wait for Pearl to sort through her own emotions. He focused his attention on helping prepare the Davies homestead for winter, reinforcing the stable roof, chopping and stacking firewood, making sure the cabin was properly sealed against drafts. Samuel, blissfully unaware of the unspoken tension between the adults, thrived under Jacob's continued mentorship. His riding skills improved daily, and he soaked up Jacob's lessons about ranch management, animal husbandry, and survival skills with endless enthusiasm. It was during one such lesson, as Jacob taught Samuel how to check for signs of predators near the chicken coop, that Pearl finally acknowledged the truth to herself. Watching them together, the man she'd come to love, and the son who already adored him, she realized that her hesitation stemmed not from uncertainty about her feelings, but from guilt. Loving Jacob felt, in some irrational corner of her heart, like betraying Thomas. As if happiness somehow dishonored the grief she'd carried these past 2 years. That evening, after Jacob had departed with his customary restraint and Samuel was asleep, Pearl retrieved a small box from beneath her bed. Inside were the few keepsakes she had of Thomas, their wedding photograph, his pocket watch, the letters he'd written during his occasional business trips to Cheyenne. Pearl traced her late husband's face in the faded photograph, remembering his kindness, his dreams for their future, his joy when Samuel was born. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to truly remember Thomas not as an idealized memory, but as the man he had been loving but sometimes impatient, ambitious but occasionally reckless, devoted to his family but sometimes overwhelmed by the challenges of frontier life. "What would you want for us, Thomas?" Pearl whispered to the photograph. "For Samuel, for me," the answer, when it came, felt like it originated from within her own heart rather than from any supernatural source. Thomas had always wanted their happiness above all else. He would not have wished for her to remain alone, for Samuel to grow up without a father's guidance, for the homestead they'd built together to struggle when a partnership could help it flourish. Pearl carefully replaced the items in the box, then slipped it back beneath her bed. A sense of peace settled over her, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. The next morning, Pearl woke with clarity and purpose. After breakfast, she asked Mrs. Nelson from the neighboring homestead to watch Samuel for a few hours. Then she hitched her wagon and set out for Jacob Forrester's ranch, a place she had never visited despite their months of acquaintance. The Forrester property was impressive even by Wyoming standards, nearly 2,000 acres of prime grazing land with a substantial main house, bunkhouse, barns, and outbuildings. As Pearl approached, she could see the evidence of prosperity and good management in the well-maintained fences, the healthy cattle, the overall orderliness of the operation. Several ranch hands noticed her arrival, their curious glances following her wagon as she drove toward the main house. Before she reached it, however, Jacob emerged from one of the barns, clearly surprised by her unexpected appearance. He approached the wagon as Pearl brought it to a halt, removing his hat as he neared. "Pearl, is everything all right? Is Samuel? Samuel is fine," she assured him quickly. "He's with Mrs. Nelson." Relief crossed Jacob's features, followed by curiosity. "This is an unexpected pleasure, then," Pearl gathered her courage. "I was hoping we might speak privately." Understanding dawned in Jacob's eyes. "Of course. Would you like to come inside?" Pearl nodded, allowing him to help her down from the wagon. As they walked toward the main house, she took in her surroundings with new interest, seeing not just a successful ranch but a potential home. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable, masculine in its furnishings but warm and welcoming. Jacob led her to a sitting room where a fire already burned in the stone hearth despite the early hour. "Would you like coffee? Tea?" he offered, clearly trying to make her comfortable. Pearl shook her head. "No, thank you. I didn't come for refreshments, Jacob." He nodded, taking a seat across from her, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his anticipation. "What brings you all this way, then?" Pearl took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I've been thinking about what you said, about your feelings and about the future you could imagine for us." Jacob remained silent, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "When Thomas died, I thought I would never feel happiness again," Pearl explained. "Just existing day to day took all my strength. There was no room to consider anything beyond survival, not just for myself, but for Samuel." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Then you rode into our lives that night in July, risking everything to save my son. And suddenly, the world seemed larger again, full of possibilities I'd forgotten existed." Pearl met his gaze directly. "I love you, Jacob Forrester. I love your strength, your gentleness, your integrity. I love the way you've embraced Samuel, teaching him and guiding him as if he were your own. I love the man you are and the future I believe we could build together." The words, once spoken, seemed to fill the room with their power. Jacob's expression transformed, joy replacing caution in his eyes. "Are you saying," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm saying yes," Pearl confirmed simply. "Yes to your unasked question, yes to partnership, to family, to a future together." Jacob crossed the space between them in an instant, kneeling before her chair and taking her hands in his. "Pearl Davies, you have made me the happiest man in the Wyoming territory." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "Are you certain? I don't want you to feel rushed," or Pearl silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I've never been more certain of anything," she assured him. "The only question remaining is whether you still want." This time it was Jacob who interrupted, rising to his feet and pulling Pearl gently up with him. "I want nothing more in this world than to make you and Samuel my family," he said fervently. "To build a life together, to face whatever challenges come our way as partners, to create a legacy that would honor Thomas's memory while forging our own path forward." As his words washed over her, Pearl felt the last of her reservations dissolve. Standing on tiptoe, she closed the distance between them and pressed her lips to his in their first kiss. Jacob's response was gentle at first, then increasingly passionate as Pearl returned his fervor. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, years of longing and months of restraint giving way to joyful celebration of their newfound understanding. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I have loved you from afar for so long," he confessed quietly. "To hold you now feels like a dream." Pearl smiled, her hands resting on his chest, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath her palms. "Not a dream," she assured him, "a beginning." Jacob Forrester and Pearl Davies were married on a crisp November morning in 1885, in the small white church in Lusk. The entire community turned out for the occasion, recognizing in their union a story worth celebrating, a tale of courage, healing, and love born from adversity. Samuel, resplendent in a new suit ordered specially from Cheyenne, stood proudly beside his mother during the ceremony, his small face solemn with the importance of the occasion. When the minister pronounced Jacob and Pearl husband and wife, it was Samuel who cheered first and loudest, causing ripples of laughter to spread through the congregation. The reception that followed at the Forrester Ranch was the social event of the season. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by neighboring families. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the air as couples danced in the cleared space of the main barn, decorated for the occasion with evergreen boughs and paper lanterns. As twilight descended, Jacob found his bride standing alone for a moment, watching as Samuel demonstrated his growing horsemanship skills to a group of admiring children. "Mrs. Forrester," Jacob said, testing the new name as he slipped an arm around her waist. "Are you enjoying your wedding day?" Pearl leaned into his embrace, a contented smile playing on her lips. "More than I could have imagined, though I'm beginning to think your entire ranch staff has made it their mission to spoil Samuel beyond redemption." Jacob chuckled, following her gaze to where his foreman was now hoisting Samuel onto Thunder's back for a brief ride around the corral. "They're just welcoming the newest Forrester, though I suspect you're right about the spoiling." "I've been thinking," Pearl said after a comfortable silence. "Perhaps we should make it official Samuel's status. I mean, if you were to adopt him legally, he could take your name." Jacob's arm tightened around her waist. "I would be honored, Pearl, but only if Samuel wishes it. We can ask him together," Pearl suggested, "tomorrow when we're settled." Jacob nodded, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Tomorrow, the first day of our new life together." As if sensing he was being discussed, Samuel looked up from atop Thunder and waved enthusiastically to his mother and new stepfather. They waved back in unison, their joined hands a symbol of the family they had become. Winter settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing with it the expected challenges: snowstorms that isolated the ranch for days at a time, bitter cold that tested even the sturdiest structures, shortened days that limited productive work hours. Yet within the Forrester household, the season brought unexpected joys as well. Pearl discovered that managing a large ranch home wasn't so different from running her homestead, just on a grander scale. The staff, a cook, 2 maids, and the various ranch hands respected her practical knowledge and quiet authority. She found satisfaction in creating a true home out of what had previously been merely a well-run bachelor establishment. Samuel thrived in his new environment, dividing his time between lessons with Pearl and following Jacob around the ranch, absorbing knowledge about cattle, horses, and land management. His official adoption was finalized just before Christmas, a gift that brought tears to the boy's eyes when he realized he would now be Samuel Forrester in name as well as in heart. As for Jacob, the happiness of those winter months exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Coming home each evening to Pearl's warm welcome and Samuel's excited recounting of the day's activities filled a void in his life he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. The ranch, once simply his livelihood, became the foundation for something far more precious: a family legacy. Spring arrived in 1886, with its usual Wyoming fickleness: warm days followed by sudden snow squalls, promising sunshine giving way to drenching rains. The cycle of ranch life intensified with the season calving required constant attention. Fields needed preparation for planting. Repairs postponed during winter months demanded immediate action. It was during this busy period that Pearl made a discovery that would further transform their family. The symptoms were familiar from her experience with Samuel: morning sickness, unexpected fatigue, certain foods suddenly unappetizing. By April, she was certain enough to share the news with Jacob. She chose a quiet evening after Samuel had gone to bed, joining her husband in his study where he was reviewing the ranch ledgers. Jacob looked up with a smile as she entered, pushing aside his paperwork. "I was just thinking of coming to find you," he said, holding out a hand to draw her closer. "These figures can wait until morning." Pearl allowed herself to be pulled onto his lap, a position that still made her blush despite 6 months of marriage. "I'm glad you're not too engrossed in ranch business, because I have some news that might distract you further." Jacob's arms encircled her waist, his expression curious. "Good news, I hope?" Pearl placed her hand over his, guiding it to rest against her still flat stomach. "The best news, I think. We're going to have a baby, Jacob." His expression transformed from curiosity to wonder in an instant. "A baby." You're certain? Pearl nodded, smiling at his reaction. As certain as one can be at this stage, the child should arrive in late November, near our anniversary. Pearl, that's wonderful. Jacob's voice was thick with emotion as he pulled her closer, burying his face against her neck. A child of our own. Samuel will be delighted, Pearl predicted. He's been asking for a brother or sister since Christmas. Jacob laughed, his joy infectious. Has he now? Well, I'm glad we're able to accommodate his request. Pearl grew more serious. Are you truly happy about this, Jacob? I know we hadn't specifically discussed expanding our family so soon. Jacob cupped her face in his hands, his eyes intense. Pearl Forrester, having a child with you is a blessing I hardly dared hope for. I could not be happier if you told me we'd struck gold on the north pasture. His sincerity erased any lingering concerns she might have harbored. Pearl leaned forward to kiss him, sealing their shared joy with the promise of their deepening love. The news of Pearl's pregnancy spread quickly through the household and then the broader community. Samuel was indeed thrilled by the prospect of a sibling, peppering both adults with questions about the baby's development and his future role as a big brother. Jacob's ranch hands offered hearty congratulations, though the older among them exchanged knowing glances, aware that their boss would now be distracted by family matters during the busy summer and fall seasons. As Pearl's pregnancy progressed, the pattern of their life adjusted to accommodate her changing condition. Jacob insisted on hiring additional household help despite Pearl's protests that she was perfectly capable of managing her usual duties. Samuel appointed himself his mother's special helper, fetching items she needed and reminding her to rest when she seemed tired. By late summer, Pearl's pregnancy was clearly visible, her elegant figure now softly rounded with new life. Jacob found her more beautiful than ever, frequently catching himself watching her as she moved through the house or garden, marveling at the miracle they had created together. One evening in early September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel already asleep after an exhausting day of ranch activities, Jacob voiced a question that had been on his mind. Have you thought about names for the baby? He asked, his hand resting gently on Pearl's expanding belly. Pearl smiled, covering his hand with hers. I've been considering a few possibilities. If it's a boy, perhaps William after my father, or James, which was Thomas's middle name. She glanced at Jacob, gauging his reaction. Would you mind that, honoring Thomas in that way? Not at all, Jacob assured her sincerely. Thomas will always be part of our family's story. Samuel's father deserves to be remembered. Pearl's eyes filled with grateful tears. Thank you for understanding that. Not every man would be so generous. And if it's a girl? Jacob asked, changing the subject to spare her emotional distress. Pearl's expression brightened. For a girl, I was thinking of Elizabeth. It's a family name on my mother's side, and I've always found it elegant yet practical. Elizabeth Forrester, Jacob tested the name aloud. It has a fine sound to it. We could call her Eliza for short, Pearl suggested, or Beth. I like both, Jacob approved, though perhaps we should wait to meet her before deciding which suits her best. As autumn painted the Wyoming landscape with golden hues, Pearl's thoughts increasingly turned toward the approaching birth. Her first experience with childbirth had been in Philadelphia, surrounded by female relatives and with a doctor in attendance. This time, she would deliver at the ranch, with only the local midwife to assist. Jacob, sensing her unspoken concerns, arranged for the most experienced midwife in the territory to stay at the ranch for the 2 weeks surrounding Pearl's expected delivery date. He also ensured that their fastest horses were always ready in case the doctor needed to be summoned from Douglas. You've thought of everything, Pearl remarked when he shared these precautions with her. I'm trying, Jacob admitted. Though I confess the prospect of you going through childbirth terrifies me more than any stampede or blizzard I've faced. Pearl squeezed his hand reassuringly. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Jacob, and I've done it before, remember. That doesn't make it less frightening, he replied, his voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. The thought of anything happening to you or the baby. Nothing will happen, Pearl promised, though they both knew such assurances could never be absolute. We'll have a healthy child, and by Christmas, our family will be complete. November arrived with unexpected mildness, the weather holding fair well past the time when snow usually blanketed the territory. The midwife, Mrs. Holloway, arrived at the ranch on the 15th, settling into the guest room and quickly establishing herself as a calming presence. Second babies often come easier than firsts, she assured Pearl during their initial consultation. And you're strong and healthy, I foresee no complications. The prediction proved accurate when, in the early hours of November 29th, one day after their first wedding anniversary, Pearl woke Jacob with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said simply, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. Jacob was immediately alert, helping Pearl through the first contractions before waking Mrs. Holloway and arranging for a ranch hand to stay with Samuel, who remained asleep, unaware of the drama unfolding. The labor progressed more quickly than anyone anticipated. By mid-morning, Pearl's pains were coming rapidly, her composure giving way to primal sounds that tore at Jacob's heart as he paced outside the bedroom door, banished by Mrs. Holloway after his anxious hovering became more hindrance than help. Just past noon, a new cry filled the Forrester home, the lusty wail of a newborn announcing its arrival. Jacob froze in his pacing, every sense focused on that miraculous sound. Moments later, Mrs. Holloway opened the bedroom door, her face wreathed in smiles. "Congratulations, Mr. Forrester," she said warmly. "You have a beautiful daughter." Jacob entered the room with reverent steps, his eyes immediately finding Pearl propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. The sight stopped his breath. "Come meet Elizabeth," Pearl invited softly. "She's perfect." Jacob approached the bed and carefully sat on its edge, gazing down at the tiny face peeking from the blankets. Elizabeth Forrester had a cap of dark hair, her mother's delicate features, and when she opened her eyes briefly, Jacob saw they were the same deep blue as his own. "She's miraculous," he whispered, reaching out to touch one perfect miniature hand. Tiny fingers instinctively curled around his larger one, and Jacob felt his heart expand with a love so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. "Would you like to hold her?" Pearl asked, recognizing the emotion overwhelming her husband. Jacob nodded wordlessly, accepting the precious bundle with careful hands. As he cradled his daughter against his chest, the journey that had brought them to this moment flashed through his mind: the desperate midnight ride for medicine, Samuel's recovery, the courtship and marriage that had created their blended family, and now this perfect new life that represented their shared future. "Welcome to the world, Elizabeth Forrester," he murmured to his daughter. "You are already so loved." A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Holloway opened it to reveal Samuel, wide-eyed with anticipation. "Is the baby here?" he asked, his voice hushed with awe. "Can I see?" Pearl smiled tiredly. "Come in, Samuel. Come meet your sister." The boy approached cautiously, climbing onto the bed beside his mother while Jacob lowered Elizabeth so Samuel could see her face. "She's so small," Samuel observed, reaching out to gently touch the baby's cheek. "Was I that small?" "Even smaller," Pearl assured him, "but you grew strong and tall, and Elizabeth will too." Samuel studied his sister with serious concentration. "I'm going to teach her everything," he decided. "How to ride horses and find heart stones and avoid rattlesnakes. I'm sure she'll appreciate having such a knowledgeable big brother," Jacob said solemnly, though his eyes danced with amusement as they met Pearl's over the children's heads. As the afternoon waned into evening, the new family remained together in the quietness of the bedroom, basking in the miracle of Elizabeth's arrival and the completeness she brought to their circle. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the Wyoming landscape in white as if nature itself were celebrating the newest Forrester. In the years that followed, the story of how Jacob and Pearl Forrester found each other became something of a legend in Lusk, and the surrounding communities a tale told and retold at social gatherings, church suppers, and special celebrations. The desperate midnight ride through a storm to save a dying child evolved in the telling, gaining dramatic embellishments with each retelling until it resembled something from a dime novel. Jacob and Pearl themselves rarely corrected these exaggerations, understanding that communities need their myths and heroes. Besides, the essential truth remained unchanged. A moment of crisis had revealed the character of a man and the courage of a woman, forging a bond that grew into one of the territory's most successful partnerships, both personal and professional. The Forrester Ranch prospered under their joint management, expanding its operations to include not just cattle, but also horse breeding, with a particular focus on developing sturdy, intelligent mounts suited to the demanding Wyoming environment. Samuel, growing into a thoughtful young man with his stepfather's practicality and his mother's compassion, showed a remarkable talent for working with even the most challenging horses. Elizabeth, nicknamed Beth by her adoring family, grew into a spirited girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. By the time she was 5, she was following Samuel around the ranch, absorbing his lessons about horses and ranch management with the same enthusiasm he had once shown for Jacob's teachings. 2 more children joined the family in subsequent years: William, born in 1889, and Catherine, arriving as a somewhat unexpected blessing in 1893 when Pearl was 36. Each addition brought new joy to the Forrester household, creating a family that balanced Jacob's quiet strength with Pearl's nurturing wisdom. Samuel Forrester never forgot the illness that had nearly claimed his life or the man who had braved a storm to save him. Though he had few concrete memories of the event itself, the story as told by his mother and stepfather shaped his understanding of family, courage, and responsibility. When he turned 18 in 1899, he surprised no one by announcing his intention to study medicine, combining his love of horses with a desire to serve the still developing communities of Wyoming as a veterinarian. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1905, nearly 20 years after Jacob Forrester's fateful ride, the extended Forrester family gathered on the ranch to celebrate Pearl's 48th birthday. The original homestead, where she had raised Samuel alone after Thomas's death, had been preserved and maintained, though no one lived there now. It stood as a monument to beginnings, to struggle, to the foundation upon which their current prosperity had been built. After the celebration, as the younger children played under the watchful eyes of ranch hands and the women of the family cleared away the remains of the feast, Jacob and Pearl found themselves alone for a rare moment, seated on the porch of the old homestead. "Do you ever miss it?" Jacob asked, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed out at the landscape turned golden by the setting sun. "This simpler life," Pearl considered the question, leaning into his embrace. At 48, she remained as beautiful to him as she had been at 28, though silver now threaded through her auburn hair, and the challenges of bearing and raising 4 children had left their marks on her body. "I miss certain aspects," she admitted. "The quiet. The sense of accomplishment in handling everything myself." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft with memory. "But I wouldn't trade what we've built together for anything in this world." Jacob nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Their life together had not been without challenges, droughts that threatened the ranch, economic downturns that strained their resources, the normal conflicts that arise in any family. Yet through it all, the foundation laid during those early days had held firm. 20 years ago, I would never have imagined this life," Jacob mused. "I was content enough with my ranch and my independence, or so I thought. And now," Pearl prompted, though she knew the answer. "Now I understand that true contentment comes from connection," Jacob replied, squeezing her shoulders gently. "From family, from building something that will outlast us both." Pearl smiled, thinking of their children: Samuel studying veterinary medicine in Colorado, Elizabeth preparing for her first teaching position at the new school in Lusk, William showing Jacob's gift for ranch management at 16, and 12-year-old Catherine already displaying artistic talent that had the entire family convinced she was destined for greater things. "We have built something wonderful," she agreed softly. "Something that started right here on this porch when a cowboy promised to return with help." Jacob turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "The best promise I ever made," he said simply, "and the best one I ever kept." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of pink and gold, Jacob Forrester leaned forward to kiss his wife of nearly 20 years, the woman who had taught him that the greatest adventures didn't come from riding through storms or facing danger, but from opening one's heart to love and possibility. In that moment, surrounded by the legacy they had built together, both silently acknowledged the truth that had guided their journey from its desperate beginning to its prosperous present. Some promises change not just the lives of those who make them, but the very landscape of the heart itself.